This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American, and I'm here with Dr. Emily Bashah. Now, today we're going to talk about something that I have failed at probably 1,000 times in my life, or at least a lot, and that is the whole concept of personal relationships. Dr. Bashah plays a special role in this. One is she's a counselor, a psychologist who's dealt with lots of people who have lots of different challenges in their personal relationship. And second, she has to deal with me. In dealing with me, Dr. Bashah and I are partners, and I'm a case study all by myself. But anyway, watch the show. I think you'll enjoy it. I'm here with Dr. Bashah, and you're here with the Optimistic American. We're here to talk about hope. All right, Dr. Bashah. Today on the Optimistic American, we're going to be talking about relationships and how partners can get along with one another. Now, I have to admit, I have dreaded talking about this subject more than any other. In this little workshop that we put together to help people find agency, this was the one that I dreaded the most, so I put it off almost till the last.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we've been talking about it. It's, themes have been weaved through all of the other episodes, and we're talking about intimacy here.
Yeah, sometimes we talk about this almost every day.
In fact, we do.
Yeah,
you should give yourself more credit.
Well, in everything that we do, we should have a good example and a bad example. And I know that I'm really good at being the bad example on relationships. So
intimate partner relationships.
So, all right. So we've developed this concept of the triple C to a healthy relationship. Those three C's are communication, compromise, and compliments. Now, I know that you've played a role in helping us simplify that, but why don't you give maybe just a little description about why we picked those three?
Yeah, I think, there's so many different things to add, and I'll definitely try to address some of the key issues. But communication is so vital and so important. If somebody that you're with isn't able to access, or even you yourself are not able to access insight into your behaviors or judgments or perceptions, it's going to be really hard to grow as a person, let alone in a relationship, because that other person is bringing all their dynamics and all their history of parent-child relationships and family dynamics into the relationship, and attachment problems or issues that might get expressed. And so if you're not aware, it makes it so much harder. And choosing how you communicate with your partner is going to be really critical and key for a successful relationship. We also talked about compromise. I think compromising is important. It's not just about conceding all the time or placating your partner. That's not what we're saying here, but really understanding what are the vital issues, what are the values that bring you together, why did you fall in love with one another, how do you continue to rekindle that relationship. Actually, a very wise man once said to me that the critical key factor to the longevity and health of his marriage was that he never stopped pursuing his wife. He never assumed that once he got her, that he could keep her. And I thought that was so beautifully put. And I think if we continue to remind ourselves, this could be gone tomorrow. And the things that we choose to fight about and that we get irritated over or blame each other for, like, what do they just go away? If you were to think that if I were to lose this person tomorrow, what really mattered? And then with the third one, complimenting, I think that's also quite important in my clinical work that I do. I often get people, single partners, who will come in and they'll be fault finders, and they're constantly nitpicking and upset and blaming their partner over all of these problems. And ultimately, I really come back to, what does that say about you? What does that say about you choosing this partner for yourself? What does that say about you engaging in this dynamic in your relationship? What do you see as part of your responsibility and agency to change? And then they may or may not choose to stay with me in therapy, because I'm ultimately saying I'm not just going to be here allowing that kind of dynamic to being replicated in therapy with me, that you have to experience some of that responsibility, accountability, and agency in yourself.
All right, so let's go back to the first one, which was communication. On communication, it seems to me, I know one of the things that I do is I get a story stuck inside my head. I get a story stuck inside my head when I communicate that kind of brings me to the conclusion of what's going to happen in the communication. And oftentimes I can react incorrectly because of it. Whereas if I let that story go and I was more open to other possibilities, giving the other person the benefit of a doubt in communicating, I'd be able to do a better job of connecting with them. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about that concept and what's happening in that?
Yeah, I have a great example that I think maybe helps to elucidate some of this. So one day I came home and I was frustrated. There had been kind of this ongoing crisis and issue. There was no resolution that I was able to achieve.
In your work.
In my work at the end of the day. And so it really left me feeling angry and frustrated and irritable. And so you and I had something that we were preparing for the next day and really needed to talk through it. And I knew I was running on very limited power and like brain energy and even and especially emotional attunement. And so I came in and I just had to forewarn you. Like, I need pre-forgiveness now, and I'm going to try my best to
By the way, I love this concept of pre-forgiveness. Why don't you explain that?
So you actually brought this into our relationship, which I think is very powerful. And it's saying that, you know, we're human. We're going to fail. We're going to do things that upset one another as intimate partners, and that it's not intentional.
And I think pre-forgiveness is best used when you know that you're already stressed. Like you're walking into a wedding with a partner and you know they don't know everyone and you have to do the introduction for them. You have to introduce them to people that they don't know. And you kind of think through the strategy in your head as to how you're going to do it, but you know you're going to blow it. You know you're going to make mistakes. So asking for pre-forgiveness up front, letting them know here are the areas where I'm worried about messing up, and I hope that you can pre-forgive me up front. It is amazing how people will do it, how they'll give you that benefit of a doubt and actually help you in those conversations.
Yeah, and in the process, as I'm watching myself now saying that to you, I think it was also helpful for me to really self-regulate and control. Okay, I could feel this irritability and anger bubbling at the surface. It's not about you, nor do I want to direct it at you, but it could easily happen. And so let me not make that mistake. And I think that happens so much. Like we treat the people that we love the worst because we assume that they're not going to abandon us or leave us. And I mean, that's nice on the one hand, but it's not nice to how you're mistreating the people that you really care about and love. And it could be a family pet. It could be a child. It could be a partner.
When you did that, I think it's important to talk about what was happening to both of us psychologically, mentally. You asked for pre-forgiveness because you knew you were stressed about something that happened at work, and you were afraid that you might, by whatever else was happening in our household that night, that you might overreact. Well, that did a couple of things. Number one, it let me know there was an issue. Number two, it also let me know, oh, okay, so she needs some help on this. So I'm going to kind of be
gentle.
I needed
you to be gentle,
and be
yeah.
alert to what's going to happen.
Help
I
me.
felt like, well, I love being asked to help, right? I love being a part of the solution. And so you're kind of drawing me in, asking for help and assistance, and I want to be able to do that, as opposed to, you know, had I not known and then you have done something, I would have created some story in my head as to what you were doing, how, you know, maybe I wasn't getting the respect that I thought that I deserved or whatever else might be going on inside my head. I now kind of have a new narrative. I have a new story inside of my head that you helped frame. But most importantly, you also framed it for yourself. You didn't do anything that night that ended up being mean or upset, although I have to be honest with you. If somebody were to ever blame somebody for being mean in a relationship, they'd have to blame me over you. You rarely are. But I think it helped you. I think it helped you know, okay, this is something that I'm going to have to be aware of.
And for our relationship, I externalize the problem rather than making it about you or making you think that it was about you if you didn't have the context for how I was feeling when I walked in the door. And I think that is really important in relationships to be able to externalize the problem, name it, put it outside of your relationship, and that way the other person isn't going to feel threatened by it. My tendency, on the other hand, is to personalize things. So if you're not giving me context, my brain automatically goes to assuming he's responding that way because of something I did or I said. And it's a tendency, but it's also a fallacy. And so I also need that context from you to be able to stay sane in our relationship. Do you want to give us your example? I thought you handled it really well of a time when you were also dealing with a very stressful situation.
Okay. I'm not sure I quite like going through what my challenges were, but I think I know the one that you're talking about. Mainly because I did something right in it.
Yes, you did.
We've had lots of conversations about trying to put out, even when there's something stressful going on with you, to put it out and to put it on the table. My tendency is to look at the situation and to believe the following. I'm not supposed to have problems. I'm supposed to help you deal with yours. Well, of course, the truth is, of course I have problems and challenges that are going on inside of my life, and those have emotional effects on me, right?
And we're practicing.
So you came home, and when you came home, I had a problem with my email. And the problem with my email was that I needed to get it hooked up to a new iPad. I went to hook it up to a new iPad, and it wouldn't download it. So I called the service administrator and told them about it. And they go, okay, well, we'll change the email and that'll fix it. So we changed the email, and then I not only couldn't get it on the new iPad, it shut off on my phone. I also had a closing going on, a closing of a real estate business deal that was supposed to happen the next morning. And I had a lot of documents that I was supposed to review that was worth a lot of money to my partners, right? And they were depending upon me and my signatures and reviewing it and doing the things that I would need to do. I was super stressed. So you come home, walk in through the door, and I am
not knowing any of this.
Not knowing any of it. And you walk over to give me a kiss and to get my attention, right? And the truth was, I couldn't do it, right? Now, normally I would try to placate you and then move back to doing what I was doing. But what I realized as I was already getting ready to do that, that I was looking standoffish and that you were going to personalize it.
Yeah, I felt rejected. You weren't making eye contact with me. You were looking away. You seemed extremely distracted. So I could see something was going on, but ultimately it led to me feeling rejected.
Right. And so I then said, my email's really messed up, and if I don't get this fixed, I've got a disaster in the morning, right? And I'm sorry, but I just can't do anything else right now but focus on this. And that you then said, oh, okay, I understand. I'll give you some space to be able to go and deal with it. Now, what I eventually had to do literally was let go of it till the next day because I couldn't get a hold of the service provider, which then stressed me for most of the night. The point is that it's not, I'm going to say my nature. I don't think that's true. It's not in my training and my upbringing and the roles that I played to talk to other people about my problems and my challenges. Most of the time, I'm talking to them about their problems and their challenges and trying to help them get better. And the thing that is sometimes hard to recognize is, of course, you have challenges and problems, and it's not necessarily abnormal, but you can't get people to even, not only can you not get help, you can make the situation a lot worse if you don't at least inform people about what's going on.
Yeah, so knowing my tendency in relationship is to personalize things, I absolutely need, and we've communicated this, I absolutely need to know where you're at and where I fit in the process. And so that if there are things that are going on outside of me, it gives me information to be able to say, that sucks. If I was in your situation, absolutely, I would feel just as stressed out. And what do you need from me? And if it's to leave you alone, give you space, take care of our daughter, play with her in another room to give you a chance to like think through some creative solutions. At least I could feel more like an ally rather than a deterrent or a contributor to the problem. And that helped me get through it. And so in both of our scenarios, I think that we really navigated that really well, because life is going to happen. Stressful situations are, predictable. We know that they're going to occur. Things are going to happen outside of our control. Nothing in life happens fluidly, seamlessly, without effort. And we're making conscious decisions towards the outcomes that we want. And that's having intimacy, trust, connection, and love and safety in our relationship.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this is oftentimes when I've thought about communication, I oftentimes have thought about it in terms of, hey, let's make certain that we can try to understand her issues, her vulnerabilities, problems, or challenges that she's having. Let's talk about those. Let's figure out the role that I'm playing in it, figure out how we can make it better. Two things I think are amiss in that. The first one is to believe that somehow or another I don't have those same challenges and issues, and that I need to put my stuff on the table, which is not easy for me to be able to do. Mm-hmm. But the more important one here that I really like about this example is that it's about the moment of crisis. Mm-hmm. We all have these moments of crisis in every relationship. The relationship between a couple, the relationship between partners in a business, the relationships that we have with vendors and suppliers. Every relationship, we have this moment of crisis. And that moment of crisis comes about because you have a story going on in your head and they have a story going on in their head. And you're both going to react to that story. And that story may not be at all visible to the other side. They may not understand it at all. And if they did understand it, you have some chance that you can find some common space, some common ground.
The worst thing that I see happening in therapy is that people fight over text. It is the worst thing, and especially of vulnerable issues or sensitive topics. And I'll often say to my clients, well, why didn't you call them? Why didn't you arrange to meet with them? Why didn't you say, let's hold off until we can speak face to face? Nothing's going to happen, but you're going to exacerbate the problem further if you're trying to fight via text. It is the worst thing.
Yeah, I've told my sons, and I tell people who work for me that that there are zero deals that are done by text or email. None. Mm-hmm. Because for a deal to happen, you have to be able to establish trust. Mm-hmm. To establish trust, you can't do it by a text. Mm-hmm. In fact, what you will do by the trust is that story that's going on in your head. You'll read that text and you will apply your story to that text, which may not have been the intent of the other person at all.
Yeah, so, you miss the nuances, you miss the hesitations, you miss the words that people choose when they're describing things to you, the opportunity to ask them what matters most to them. How people have failed them in the past, how that's maybe influencing their decisions right now. I mean, all of those things get missed. Mm-hmm. One other thing I want to add to the communication strategy is really thinking about what are you conveying and communicating to your partner. If you were to step outside yourself and adopt their being and sensing of you, what do you perceive? It's very hard to do, but really try to do this. And you can do this for a child. This is a great exercise that I'll often give parents so that you can see how it feels. I mean, do you come across as sounding threatening or sarcastic or constantly belittling or overpowering? Really listen and feel for, through sensing, through that other person's perception, because you'll learn about yourself. It's hard to see our habits, but if you listen for them, one of the things that can happen is being overly critical of your partner. This is very toxic in relationships. And I mentioned it earlier as an example. Clients will often come in and be fault finders of their partners, and that in itself is a problematic behavior. What you ultimately want to do, if you want to bring out the best in your intimate partner and also yourself through the process, think about reinforcing the behaviors that you want through compliments, through praise, through saying, when you said that to me, that really mattered to me, and I appreciate you saying that. And then if you're going to give any criticisms, make sure that that is overpowered and overbalanced by that positive reinforcing messages. Because what you're doing is you're ultimately bringing out the things that you want to see more of.
Okay, so that brings us to the third C. We'll go ahead and come back to compromise. But on the idea of compliments, I think it is way overlooked. I really do believe, there's different philosophies. Some people believe that people learn by criticism. They learn by people being on their back. They learn by people pushing them to get done what needs to be done. I believe people learn and lead by inspiration. That's the way that it works best. So, there are lots of different examples, but I imagine somebody that we have working on the front line that's dealing with a healthcare customer. If the person dealing with a healthcare customer, somebody who's having some type of healthcare issue on the other side, they may be upset because something didn't go right with their provider that they met with, or something didn't go right with the price that they thought that they should pay for a drug. If we have a rigid set of rules for the person who's on the telephone, and we create a system of punishments designed to make certain that we penalize them for not doing everything that's right, it will not be beyond them when the customer asks for help on something to bark back at them, to say, that's not the way it works here. Here are the rules. Here's what we need to do. Because we're telling them they're the rules, they're going to tell the customer these are the rules. Now, you have to have some rules in the process. But what you want to do is you want to give especially those frontline people agency, the ability to believe in themselves and to know that if they try to find something to resolve the challenge for the customer, that they're not going to be penalized for it, even if it doesn't work out perfectly right. And I see this in all types of businesses where people who are on the front line, we've noticed it in getting on airlines, where you'll sometimes now see people who are barking at people as they're trying to get on the airplane because they didn't follow the rules right or pack the stroller correctly. The point I guess I'm giving to you is, I think oftentimes that's being done because the person on the front line feels that they work inside of an institution that doesn't give them any latitude, that they feel that they need to follow the rules. And instead then of being helpful and trying to work with the customer, they're just simply there as an enforcement mechanism. Mm-hmm. That is a terrible model for a company. That's a terrible model for a relationship. Mm-hmm. Compliments are partly from inspiration. If you are constantly telling someone what you don't want, you're going to have a very low ability to find success. But if you instead are complimenting the things that you want and that you like and that you're wanting to make certain that are going to become a part of that relationship that you have, whether it's with a partner, an employee, or for that matter, a spouse, your likelihood of getting that outcome is much greater.
Very well put. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I think of a skiing example, when you're first learning to ski and the instructor is saying, look where you want to go, not in the tree line, look where you want to go. And I think, it's a great metaphor for life. If you're constantly looking at, what could go wrong or what you don't want to happen or what incites fear or, where the problems are, you're going to miss where you want to go. And so keep your eye on the ball. Sure, it's important that you want to have some mechanisms in place to not fail, and especially if you know certain things about yourself that tend to be fallible in relationships, because we can see patterns existing over time and the ways that you contribute to the detriment of relationships, then that's important learning for yourself, but always keeping your eye on where do you want this to go and how can you participate in this?
All right, so let's go to compromise. And let's talk about the concept itself and when and where compromise is important.
Yeah, I think compromising often can be misunderstood because people can see that as, oh, I have to give up things that matter to me or are important to me in order to satisfy my partner. And the danger in that is codependent patterns in relationships can develop when a person loses their identity, when they absorb all of their partner's interests, their partner's values, their partner's identity, and they slowly stop spending time with their family or their friends, or their interests or their hobbies. And they really like take over the persona of this other person, and they allow that person to really dominate and dictate what happens in their relationship. It can develop into an abusive relationship if it goes to more extremes, and it can just be more psychologically abusive, not just physically. But when it tends to move into that extreme of psychological abuse, you can see control over finances, control over what their partner is allowed to wear, how attractive they may look, how much time they're spending with others, who they're seeing outside of themselves. So once you start seeing all of those things come into place, that's where you really have that power and control issue that's happening. It can be subtle and it can happen over time. So it's really hard to identify and say, I lost my identity here.
What does codependency actually mean?
So codependency is an excessive form of emotional dependence on a partner, emotional and psychological dependence on a partner.
All right. So how do you deal with this with especially male-female relationships? There are some what they call traditional relationships where oftentimes the female will think that it's their job to be subordinate to the husband. That can stem from their religious values or their family upbringing. To me, this is an interesting question because I think there really are fundamental differences between men and women. And of course, there are lots of different types of relationships, but I'm focused on the male and female relationship right now. There are lots of different types of relationships. But in the male-female relationship, again, there's a traditional role for some women who they believe that they're supposed to be subordinate. Is there an ability to be able to find both, the ability for a woman not to be codependent, but at the same time still have a subordinate role with their spouse?
Well, I think the social trends are changing, and that we're seeing dual income household earners. So women are employed and running a household, still expected to run a household and still expected to raise the children. And so really it's just adding a lot of additional pressures. And things are getting, dual income earners are more necessary in order to maintain certain lifestyles than it used to be. So we're seeing trends changing, and it's having an impact on family and households. There's also more reliance on social supports and family supports for resources. So to answer your question, I don't know if that's really what's happening right now. In terms of relevancy, I think things are shifting.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. 60% of all women today work. That's a huge change by itself. But I do have a number of friends who have more traditional type of relationships, and at least from my standpoint, I don't have any intention to judge them for theirs or for someone who has the alternative relationship. Part of that is figuring out kind of what works for you. But I have seen that there are some women who can be in a more subordinate role, and yet they play a massive role in their family's well-being. And oftentimes, I just wouldn't call them codependent. I wouldn't call them being over that line where they're psychologically and emotionally and financially completely dependent upon their husband. I've seen the other relationships where both people were equal and they were both codependent. They had problems with alcohol or with other things that could have made it a more problematic relationship.
For some reason, I'm thinking about President Reagan's wife, Nancy, and I think, and also looking at the times, they were very different for her, obviously, but maybe subordinate isn't the right word to use here. Maybe, and I think to give the person, the partner, credit for all that they are contributing, it may not be as visible to the person on the outside, but the amount of power and support and maintaining a facade in order to protect their partner. There's a lot that can go on. Even historically, actually, I remember one of my professors wrote a thesis on, or an article on, the women who supported the pioneers in history were often the wives, and they never got any credit for it. And so if we really look at what's going on, I think that the partners in history really deserve a lot of the credit, and rather than seeing them as subordinate, seeing them as quite powerful.
I think Nancy Reagan is a perfect example. She's a perfect example for many reasons. Here's the first one. I think most people would consider Ronald Reagan to be kind of a traditional type of guy, right? He represented a whole set of religious values while he was president. I happen to like Ronald Reagan quite a bit. I had a chance to meet him. What I liked about him the most was his incredible optimism and belief that we could do better. But there is no doubt Nancy Reagan played a massive role in that administration's success. First, there's some thought that Reagan was beginning to have some problems with his mental faculties at the end of his career. She played a role in it. But she also played a role in being the gatekeeper for the image of the entire family during the time that he was president. And to say that she was a subordinate woman, I agree with you completely. I think subordination is the wrong word. I think we use it, right, because somehow or another it's become the word that talks about a traditional relationship. But even in the Bible, there's a story about like the model woman, and the model woman was industrious and productive and was able to be able to hold up a household. The point that I'm giving is that when we look at a relationship, we all play a role. And it's hard for me to know, a woman who decides, or a man who decides to stay home with the children, that's a wonderful thing. If you can afford to do that, I understand it. Heck, I would love to stay home with our daughter full time. I see there as being wonderful gifts that can come from that.
Yeah.
But it's not always possible. It's not always possible for people to make that work. It's not a bad thing either way. If you decide to stay home, I think that's an honorable way to deal with your children. At the same time, if you're working in the workplace and you're creating a role model for them as being someone who has a career or who is a professional, that's not a bad thing. Each of us make our choices, and part of those choices are driven by economics. The real key to the relationship is to make certain not, who is subordinate and who is dominant, but more importantly, is there real love inside that relationship? And are they respectful to one another? And do they both recognize the benefit that the other person is bringing, whatever type of role that they're playing?
Absolutely. My parents' marriage and relationship is such a model for me. And it's not that they don't have their own limitations or own ways that they like pick on each other, but there is deep, profound respect, and there is an acceptance that they accept each other, even with their limitations and their faults. And so I think it's important because you're not left feeling constantly disappointed and resentful. If you feel like, oh, I've got the short end of the stick here, well, they get to go out and work, and they get to meet all these people throughout the day, and they get all this praise and compliment at work, and I'm here busting my butt, and I'm doing all of these things, and you're having these growing resentments and blaming them for your problems and your misery and your suffering, that can become eternally toxic in your marriage, and I think that needs to be observed in yourself in order for it to be prevented and intervened. But my parents really, to me, serve as that model, that they don't have those deep resentments. They accept each other for who they are, even with their limitations, and there is love and respect.
Yeah, my my dad was a construction worker and my mom was a waitress, and I can tell you why they both worked. They had to.
Yeah.
It was just that simple,
Yeah.
right?
They
They
were
had
in the struggle.
a lot of kids, and they were trying to figure out how to be able to make it. My mom came here. She picked cabbage in Levine because it was all she knew how to do. My dad came here when he was 7. His brother was 11. They hitchhiked out here on their own, and he shined shoes, right? But they're both productive, industrious people who believe that they needed to be able to provide for their family, and that to me was a very, very important role. The idea again that somebody decides to stay home with the kids, no offense, that's a luxury. That's a luxury. Some of us can afford that. Some of us can't. And whether or not that's the husband or the wife staying home with the kids, like I said, I'd love to be the person staying home with my children. Again, though, the key is understanding that there's a compromise that we're going to have to give in the relationship, and that each of us are going to have to recognize and respect the role that the other person is playing. And then we have to also be willing to talk about the things that are important to us. And it's not just about giving in and subordinating yourself on either side to the other person. It's about trying to make certain that you're putting out the things that are important to you and trying to understand the things that are important to them and figuring out where that meld exists in the center.
Yeah, one of the other patterns that I tend to see that goes awry is when people are also at battle with one another in an intimate partner relationship, but they're competing. So if you're in competition with your partner, and so, I see this often with clients who are going through divorce processes, they'll say things like, my partner never supported me throughout my higher education. And then once I got my career and established, my partner seemed supportive because I'm making more money, but kind of resentful and never really proud of me when we were meeting with family and friends. They were always trying to diminish things that I've done and accomplishments that I have. And it's not that I need that praise all the time, but I just started noticing, and in fact, other people started noticing and telling me. So if you notice that as a part of a pattern in your relationship, whether it's in your partner or in yourself, I think that's also an important pattern to recognize, to be able to get some therapy, get some help to prevent further harm.
Yeah, I think, and I think the key to that is, it's, again, not easy to tell the other person that that's important to in a way in which they'll listen, right? Because if you tell them that when you're angry, good luck that it's going to have any effect, right? If you tell them that in a fight, they're just going to think it's a typical tool that you use to try to get to them, right? You have to tell them that in a moment of intimacy when both people are open to listening.
Yeah, timing is important when you're starting to convey something really vulnerable, because it's important that you get what you're needing in that moment, which might be reassurance, which might be validation. And I tell my clients, you might need to coach your partner in getting that from them. And so while you're revealing, also tell them along the way what you need from them. So I tend to find, and this is maybe a gender stereotype, men tend to be solution seekers. Women are really more process oriented. And so I think letting your partner know, I don't have a problem here I need you to fix. I really just need you to listen and be loving. And at the end, say something reassuring to me. And so tell them that verbally, because it sets the map for them so that they can succeed. And they want to succeed.
I forget the name of the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. But the idea that we're different species from different planets that somehow or another
Maybe a little hardwired
connected.
differently. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I can tell you as I don't know if it's as a man, I know when somebody tells me a problem, I want to tell them how to fix it. That's what I want to tell them how to do, right? So, and by the way, that happens to me all day long. People come to me all day long with a problem, and they go, I'm dealing with this problem, blah, blah, blah. Now, my very first instinct is always be the savior. All you need to do is blah, 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 right? Well, what I found with employees, brothers, sisters, children, that's a terrible answer.
Yeah,
right?
and it's not what they came to you for. Sometimes people are coming to you for that.
And helping them figure out, how did you get to this as being the problem? Do you think that there are other solutions? What are those other solutions? How would you go about trying to implement those? What tools do you need to be able to make that work? If you empower them, they tend to be much better at being able to find the answers. Now, it's a little different with a spouse, right? Because with a spouse, it's
That
often,
can sound patronizing.
that's right. It can sound patronizing, right?
Don't do it to me.
so the key becomes, well, I think that you can do it with a spouse on a business-related problem because that's a business-related solution, right?
And you're teaching,
That's
especially
very
if you're
different
somebody
than an
who's more
emotional
knowledgeable.
problem, right?
Yeah.
In an emotional problem, I think that, again, my tendency is I want to just give you the solution. Here, just go do this. Boom, 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 boom. That'll fix it, right? and of course, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to tell me about something that, in terms of how you
Maybe
felt,
aligning
and you
with
want to know that
you.
I understand how it was that you felt. Again, that's not always easy for men and women, and so the coaching process. If you've made up your mind, the one line that I hear from people all the time, I love it. They just don't get it. Of course, they don't get it.
Yeah.
You're different than them. They never get it. And that doesn't matter if it's the guy talking about his wife or the woman talking about her husband or the one spouse talking about the other. We're different people without gender. We come from different backgrounds. We come from different influences that were around us. There are all these things that influence us, and then add gender on top of it. The point I think that's important here is to recognize that if you can't coach the other person and help them understand where you're coming from, your odds of being able to communicate and to compromise and to get the compliments that you're looking for become become remote.
Yeah, and I know I was talking before about codependent relationships, and I think I just wanted to add another like extreme form of that to segue into trauma bonding. So just to summarize trauma bonds, these are deep emotional bonds that are based on reoccurring and cyclical patterns of trauma between a dominator and one who is dominated. So thinking of an abuse victim cyclical pattern. And so the victim in this situation tends to constantly go back to the perpetrator because it's not necessarily all inherently bad. That there's some pattern in which things that were good and helpful are reinforced, but that there's also this intermittent reward system that is happening where they're constantly going back even though they're getting hurt and harmed. And so there's just so much there to unpack. It can happen in intimate partner relationships. It can happen in cults. And it can happen with other like group leaders who are taking advantage of others who are vulnerable. And really a person loses their identity and their self-agency in the process of the relationship, giving up their power to this other person. And so they may constantly still seek that other person. It's kind of a classic example when you say, well, why would a battered woman continue to return to the batterer? It doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't she just leave? And it could be easier for a person on the outside to just see the harm that's committed. But the problem is it's not all bad, and sure, there is a lot of harm that is committed, but there's something that is keeping that person constantly going back to that person and re-engaged in that cycle.
So to me, this relates to what we talk about in addictive ideologies in an indirect way. Why do we keep watching news stations that terrify us? Why do we keep watching social media where we become increasingly worried about this apocalyptic view of what's going to happen in the world, taking us down these crazy rabbit holes? Why do we listen to politicians who are constantly talking about how we're in danger because of what the other side, the right wing or the left wing, is doing? It's always the same thing. It's fear. Right? What happens is that amygdala hijack is driven by you becoming afraid. When you become afraid, the amygdala hijacks the neocortex, and it gives you the inability to think rationally, optimistically, to be able to express love, to create, to innovate. The same thing's true in a relationship. If you are terrified about losing the other person, meaning I can't exist without them, I don't know that I have the financial resources, the money, I don't think that I have the ability to deal with life
Yeah.
without them, you've just become a captive. Just like you're a captive in politics, just like you're a captive to that news station, you become a captive. You become a victim. The first thing that I say to every one of my nieces is, whatever you do, make certain you have the ability to financially take care of yourself. That doesn't mean that you can't be someone who decides to stay at home with your children. There's, again, nothing wrong with doing that. But you should have the confidence in yourself to know, hey, if this person becomes abusive and I can't stop that abuse, that I'll be okay without them. Having agency is partly up to you. It's partly up to you deciding that you're going to play a role to make certain that you're going to be okay.
So I totally agree with that word captive. I think that really helps to depict a lot of what's going on here. And with the emotional abuse, what often happens is the perpetrator will help foster this sense of dependency on them. And then the captive has this internalized representation that is derived from what this leader, or if it's a intimate partner, has provided for them.
But it doesn't have to be an intimate partner.
It doesn't have to be an intimate
there are
partner.
all
It can
different
happen
types
with
of
a
people that can do
political
that to you in your
leader, a
life.
cult leader, a religious leader, anyone who ends up having some kind of dominance over you, and especially where you start to lose autonomy in yourself. And this sense of identity is replaced with what this person has created. And so you can see this happening in intimate partner relationships, where a person starts to believe that, okay, yeah, I can't get anyone else, because the partner tells them that all the time. You're worthless. And there is this great loss of self-esteem. There is depression and anxiety and other adverse mental health outcomes that exist. So it's making them less and less able to get out. And they lose belief in themselves, and they lose hope and become helpless. So they're better controlled and held captive, as you were describing.
Okay. Last question. There's so much going on politically on this topic. I suspect it's politically charged, but I think it's probably one of our more fascinating subjects today. What's the difference between men and women? And I think that's important if you're in a relationship that has a man and a woman, right? What's the difference between the two? Do you believe there are any differences between them?
Yeah, I think there's some really compelling research to say that we are hardwired differently and we are socialized differently. And it's hard to pinpoint, well, which is it? It is an intermix of both. There's a lot of changes and nuances in how we're describing and identifying gender. And I think that there's more of a space for men to be more expressive with their emotions than there was historically. So there are some shifts that are happening through socialization and people making more conscious decisions about how they're socializing children based on gender expectations. But having said that, yeah, there are some really fascinating studies that shows that there are some real different inheritability and genetic differences.
I can't tell you for certain what's genetic and what is learned. I do know that I've now raised 2 sons and had lots of grandkids and have a young daughter. And the one thing that's clear to me is the daughter is dramatically different than the boys, just almost by nature. Now, again, maybe I'm missing something in there, but it clearly seems that way to me. So let's go through a couple of examples. We've already mentioned one, right, that women tend to be more process-oriented and that men tend to be more product-oriented.
Focused.
Now, that may be a stereotype.
Yeah.
There may be women who are very much product-driven, and there may be men who are very much process-oriented. In fact, I know some men who are very process-oriented. But as a stereotype, meaning there's a large percentage of men who act one way and a large percentage of women who act the other, I think it's accurate. Another one that I think is interesting is, and this is now, again, my belief, and this one again may get me into trouble. I have found that women, as a part of our species, they're better people than men. All right, then that's just in general. And here's what I mean by that. Men tend to be driven by things. Right? We just are. When I was in high school, we were driven by the car that you were going to have. We were driven by the job that we were going to get. As we get older, we're driven by the house that we're going to have. Things become a dominant player in, or a dominant thought in terms of how we're driven. Women tend to be more driven by people. I mean, how many shows do you see where the man is out trying to chase, this vision of how he's going to get rich or make money or do great things?
And that is how he perceives success.
That's how he perceives success. And the woman is trying to convince him to focus on the children, right? In my experience, that stereotype, and again, it's a stereotype. That doesn't mean every man thinks that way, and it doesn't mean every woman thinks the opposite. But there's a large percentage of men who think about things, and there's a large percentage of women who think about people. I think it's a great mix. I think it's a great mix simply because your kids kind of need both.
Yeah, there can be a really beautiful interdependence there, and we don't have to force one to be another, but really look at that beautiful interdependence that we rely on each other for. If
it wasn't a male-female thing, you still need it in a relationship.
Yeah, you could look at it as separate traits, irrespective of gender. And I was thinking about gender in politics and also psychology of politics. One of my dear friends who we're hoping to have as a guest on our show, Dr. Holly Williamson, did her studies on global politics. And one of the things that she recognized in her research and work was that having women in leadership roles helped to decrease the risk of global warfare because they really worked at solidifying relationships through negotiations and through open communication. And I think that that's important rather than really engaging in a power struggle, which can happen.
By the way, you can see this in business. So one of the big issues today is this whole concept of, should we select people simply because they're a female, right? Wow, that's an interesting thought. So I can tell you, I've been involved in companies where everybody at the leadership level was men. 100% of them were men. And they began to recognize that there was a whole market segment that somehow or another they weren't appealing to, that they needed to appeal to women, right? And they selected a woman, not necessarily because if you were to line up every single trait that you wanted, that they were the best, but because they wanted the influence of a woman inside of their company to help create a balance, right? The idea that we are different because of our race, because of our gender, that comes into play with the need to be able to make a company, for that matter, a country, more successful. All right. I don't think that striving for diversity is a bad thing. And again, it's taken on this mantra amongst many people saying, well, you're only doing that because you're trying to placate the woke left, right? Or the minority. And the answer is no. You need a diversity of ideas if you want your company to have the best, broadest appeal to the most amount of people. And unfortunately, sometimes we create criteria. I know if I were to sit down and create a criteria, it would be somebody that looked a lot like me.
Right. Yeah. Right? You want the chance of survival, not just
But when I start thinking about my customer, instead of what I would want, I would create a criteria that was a lot more like them.
Yes.
And that means, again, all I'm trying to express here is there's a value that we bring to one another, that people thinking differently creates a value. I believe this in my heart of hearts. I have been all over the world. I've been in the Middle East. I've been in Russia, China. I've watched all different types of governments work. The single greatest thing that we have going on in the United States is that we want everybody to participate. We want everyone of all races, sexual orientations, sexuality.
Immigration.
We want them to participate and to become buyers and sellers. And in many countries, The answer is, oh no, there's a line who can be the buyers and sellers, and the other people are subordinate to them. I don't think it works.
No.
I know it doesn't work. I know they're not as productive. I know they can't accomplish as many things as we've been able to. Our diversity in our relationships, in our businesses, in our country, brings value. It brings value to us. And that doesn't mean every relationship should have a male and a female. Even in gay relationships, the diversity amongst them is what brings them their strength.
Yeah, I think at the core foundation, and this is my philosophy in my relationship, is do you admire them? Do you respect them? Do you love them? That is the core foundation.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So we'll see.
There was a compliment in there.
There was a compliment in there. And we'll see how many insults or people we get that are mad at us when we read our. Well, by the way, I'll state this last thing. I love it when people give comments, even the ones that don't like what it is that we're saying. My view of it is that's part of the way that I learn. Now, sometimes they're pretty rough and they're written pretty mean, and it's kind of hard to siphon through the mean comment that they're making to try to really understand what were they thinking. But there's value in it. There's value in it in being able to listen to other people and to try to understand better. And the value is to me. The value is to me in that I feel like I get better when I try to understand where other people are coming from. I think that's one of the secrets to making a relationship work, whatever type of relationship you have. There's value in the other person.
There's a really powerful comment that Teddy Roosevelt stated about being the man in the arena. And I have this quote actually in my office as a reminder to myself. And sometimes for my clients, I'll point to it and say, okay, we need to remind ourselves of this, that it's important to choose to be that man in the arena who is marred by sweat and blood and tears, despite the critics that are sitting in the stands, demeaning us or humiliating us or rejecting us, that we still have the courage to dare greatly. And I think that's so important as a reminder to myself and as I instruct and teach other people to remember that. Why are we doing this?
Yeah, and I think it is important because hopefully in listening to this show, this isn't about black and white, right and wrong. This is about trying to give the best input that we can to a whole set of generalized challenges that exist in the world today in terms of how relationships work. And it doesn't matter what the critic thinks. Love is probably the most important thing that you can find in life. And to get it, you have to dare greatly. You have to be willing to set aside the critics and to set aside the problems that might happen. And you have to get in the arena and try. There are great rewards that come from it, even though sometimes failure results from it.
Yeah, and I think just to create the extension to the intimate partner relationship that we were talking about before, sometimes we'll go into a relationship because we're afraid of getting hurt because we've been hurt so badly in our past. And so we enter the relationship with our shields up and with our weapons out, and we never put them away. We stay in the relationship with them. And so it's important to be able to put down the shield, surrender yourself to being vulnerable in the relationship. And that takes great courage to be seen, to be felt. To be loved.
Dr. Bashah, thank you. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.